There is a story about Pastor Judas, who, as the service went on and they announced that they are going to take up the offering, and the usher who collects the offering got up with the basket. He got up from the stage where he's thrown like seat, the white seats that they normally put on the stage for the pastor. He got up wearing his gown and he walked down and he walked behind the usher as he collected the offering in the offering basket. Now, some members, when they saw him doing that, they became angry that he was watching them about what and how much they were giving. Some were ashamed because they were giving little and he was seeing how little they were giving. And some were happy that the pastor was going to see how much they were giving because they were giving more than what the average member was giving. Now, when the collection was finished, he went up the pulpit and he started preaching. And he said to them, I know that some of you are angry that I was walking behind the usher as he was collecting the offering basket. I know that some of you were impressed by the fact that I saw how much you were giving. And I know that some of you were ashamed about how much little you gave, and that I saw that. Now he said, this morning, I want you to know that there is somebody who is always watching your offerings every week. It is not the usher who hands you the basket. It is our Lord Jesus Christ. He sees everything that you put in the basket every week, and he even knows how much you had left in the account when you withdraw what you're going to give at church this morning. And so today's passage is about that. It's about the fact that Jesus watches what we give every week and whenever we give, whichever way we give. So I would like us to look at today's passage as a message, not only because the way the pastor used this passage of today, you'll see, was a focus on the members who were giving. And he did not focus on what Jesus was saying to the church leaders like himself. So I would like us to look at it in both ways, because you'll see the passage for today, he started in the middle of it. But as you'll see that we are given a whole passage and he ignored the first part. So the pastor started preaching from verse 41 to verse 44 of the passage we are going to look at today. But he's supposed to have started in verse 38, which is where our passage for today begins. So I'm going to read for you Mark chapter 12. If you have your Bible, you can go there or you can watch on the screen. Mark chapter 12, verses 38 to 44. And I'm going to read from the New International Version, the NIV. From verse 38, it says, as he taught, Jesus said, watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for a show, they make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely, he said. Verse 41, which is where Pastor Judas started. He said, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worthy only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. So that's our passage for today. And you'll realize that Pastor Judas, that I mentioned in the beginning, who walked around watching what people were giving the basket, he only preached from verse 41. He didn't start in verse 38. And I believe Mark gave us the full passage because this story of the widow cannot be read apart from what comes before it from verse 38. And this week, that is what our passage is. And I would like us to look at it in that complete section. So let's look at what Jesus then says as a message, firstly, to the church leaders, to the teachers of the law, to the pastors. This is what verse 38 to 40 is about. It says, as he taught, Jesus said, watch out for the teachers of the law. Now, it is very sad that Jesus will have to warn the believers against pastors, against teachers. Now, I know that teachers of the law here are not pastors, but I think for our purposes, you can equate teachers of the law that Jesus is speaking to pastors sometimes in how they behave. And you probably have seen some of them. He says, watch out for them. Now, why does he say watch out for them? Let's see what he says. He says they like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. Now, you have seen pastors like this. Pastors who walk around wearing these long robes. Some of them, they walk around wearing the clerical collar, as it is called, so that anybody that they meet in the street or in the supermarket or wherever they are will know that this is a teacher, this is a pastor, this is a religious man. Okay? And therefore, when you arrive at places dressed like that, they are bound to give you the front seat. They are bound to give you certain favors that other people are not going to enjoy. And some of these people, Jesus says, enjoy that. So they put on these robes, they put on these clerical collars because they want the people to respect them and give them the respect in the marketplaces wherever they go. Verse 39, he says, and they have the most important seats in the synagogues. Now, some of the churches today have been designed the way the synagogue probably was designed. On the stage there on front, they have these seats that the pastor and the elders will sit on, facing down, looking at the congregation. And the congregation will be looking up at them sitting on the stage. Even the chairs that they sit on are not the normal chairs that the members are sitting on. They are special white chairs, beautifully decorated, expensive seats that they sit on. And this is what Jesus is talking about. He says they have the most important seats. And today you can even say the most expensive seats in the synagogue. And the places of all-night banquets. So when they go to weddings, when they go to any functions, they get these VIP seats because they come there dressed in their pastoral robes that everybody sees that they are pastors and they stand out. And this is what Jesus says you must watch out against. Because men like these, he says they like to do this. He says they devour widows' houses. You see, the fleshy lifestyle sometimes they lead is because they've robbed widows of their livelihoods. I've heard of stories where widows whose husbands have left them an inheritance to last them their lifetime. The pastors cheat them by telling them they must offer all of that to the church. And with that, they decorate themselves, they buy the expensive cars, they buy the expensive houses, they buy those expensive seats that they sit on in the church. And Jesus says, watch out for these kind of pastors because they are devouring widows' houses. They are devouring widows' inheritances. And this is what he is asking the members to be watchful about. And he says, last part of verse 40, he says, for a show, they make lengthy prayers. For a show, they make lengthy prayers. There's something that I personally don't like. You'll find that when there's a pastor around, people will always feel that the pastor must say the prayer. And there's no reason why any member of the church cannot give a prayer, an opening prayer or whatever at a function. And yet you find that they do that. And because of that, then they call these pastors to sit in the front seats, to sit in the VIP seats. And Jesus says, watch out for that. Because they are looking for respect from people. They are looking for exaltation from the people. And he says, we must be careful of playing to the gallery. And sadly, there are many pastors who do that are exploiting members. They are exploiting their privilege as leaders in the church. They use their positions to sometimes lord it over the members. to gain certain privileges that sometimes are not even due to them. I'm not saying pastors must not be respected. By all means, respect your pastors. But there are times when we should not be giving pastors undue respect. We must not be doing what these pastors are doing. And I think this first part of this passage of today is Jesus speaking to the pastors even before he speaks to the members. He says to pastors, avoid exalting yourself above the community by putting on these special robes that separates you from everybody else. Avoid sitting in these special seats in the synagogues or in the churches. Sit with the members, sit with everywhere everybody else is sitting. Don't have reserved seats. There's no reason why the pastor must have a reserved seat. There's no reason why he must have a special, more expensive seat to sit on when he comes to church. So I would like to discourage that practice. If any of our churches like doing that for our pastors, I would like to discourage that. That let's have the churches that are the same. In the book of James, James says, if you see members coming to the church and you take the one wearing a suit and beautiful clothes and give them the front seat, and then you see a poor man coming with old tattered clothes and you say, no, you can go sit at the back. That's the favoritism and discrimination that James says we should not practice in the church. And I think it doesn't only apply to members. It applies to members and church leaders. That church leaders must not be given that kind of preferential treatment in the church. They can sit on the same chair that everybody else sits on. They can wear similar clothes that everybody wears. People must not be able to identify who the pastor is when they walk into the church by the clothes he wears. That should not be the thing that distinguishes him. He must be pointed out in the crowd to say that is the pastor. He must not be because of what he wears and which chair he sits on. And that is the message that Jesus gives the church leaders before he even talks about the giving that we go to. So after that message that he gives then to the leaders, then he turns out in verse 41, and Mark turns then to the members. He says in verse 41, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Now, just to give you some background to what the temple treasury is. So in the temple, there were several spaces. There was a Gentile court. There was what was called the women's court, which is where the women were allowed to come in with those who were coming to pray or to offer their sacrifices. It was called the women's court. Now, it was in the women's court where the temple treasury was. Now, the temple treasury here simply refers to the baskets that they used to collect the offerings. Now, there were 13 of them, and they were shaped like a trumpet with the broad base at the bottom and the narrow base at the top, and the people will then drop their money at the top. Now, you must remember, in those days, there was no paper money. There was no notes. All the money was in coins. And these treasury receptacles were made of metal. So when you drop your coin in, it makes noise. It drops in. So if you're giving one coin, people can hear the little click when it drops in there. But if you come there with a bag full of coins, people can hear, when the lotto machines or the jackpot machine in a casino runs. So when the people come with their bags full of coins, they drop them in there. People will hear all this clanking of sounds of money falling into, and then so that man has given so much money. And that is how these things were. So they say Jesus, he went and sat opposite where these 13 receptacles were. Now, the money put in these temple treasuries was used for charity, to help the poor. It was used to maintain the temple, to buy the provisions like the wood that they use for the offerings, the incense that they use for the offerings, the things that they use in the temple, the golden articles that they use in the temple. All of those things, when they were old, they needed to be replaced or polished or cleaned up, and they used this money for that. They also used the money to also look after the poor where it was possible. Now, this is what is happening here. So Jesus sits opposite to this, and he watches people as they come and give. And he says in verse 41, many rich people threw in large amounts. Okay, how did he know they was throwing in large amounts? Because when you get there with your coins and you drop them in, they drop with clinking sounds, and you can hear that more money has been thrown in there. And when this widow comes and throw in one coin, you can hear only one coin was thrown in. So Jesus sees the rich coming and they're putting a lot of this money in there. Some of them might even have moved from, because some of these 13 trumpets that received the offerings were for different purposes. Okay, so one of them might say, okay, I want to give for this purpose and that purpose. So the person will start from the first one and you put some money there, put some money on the second one, the third one, and the fourth one. And some of them will go making a show of it as they put their offerings through all the receptacles. And this is what Jesus sees. And then in verse 42, he then says, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Now, today, you may not understand that when I grew up, for those of you who are small, when I grew up, 1 cent was not the smallest coin we had. We had what was called the half cent. Okay, it was 2 smaller coins, smaller than the 1 cent. And you could buy a lot of stuff with a half cent. A half cent could buy you, for example, a fat cook. I remember one day I picked up 2 cents on the ground when I was walking the street. And suddenly I went to call my cousin and we went to a place where they used to sell fat cook. And we went to buy 2 fat cooks, one for him, one for me, with 1 cent, with half cent each. And they even gave me my change back for 1 cent. So years ago, there was this small coin that was so small, but in value, they could do something. They could buy something for you. Now, this woman had 2 of these coins. You can call them 2 half cents if you like. And she throws these into, and probably because of the sound, you could hear what kind of coins she threw in. Now, Jesus in verse 43 calls his disciples to teach them something about what this woman has just done. He says, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put on everything she had, all she had to live on, he says. This is what this woman does. And then he says, although you have heard all the clinking of coins falling into the receptacles from the rich people, I tell you, this woman gave the most. Now, why did he say that? Because, you see, giving is a function of whence it comes. Giving 100 rand out of 1,000,000 rand and giving 100 rand out of 100 rand is very different. Although in rand value, it is the same amount. But the person who gives 100 rand and they have 1,000,000 rand don't even notice that they gave 100 rand. But a person who has only 100 rand and they give that 100 rand, they know they don't have anything else. They know they have sacrificed everything they had. And this is what this woman did, and this is what Jesus speaks to say, don't be impressed by the amount people give until you know how much they actually have. That's the only thing that should maybe impress you, if anything at all. And this woman, he says, has given out of everything. Now, you remember what he said about the church leaders. He said they devour the widows' houses. They take the widow. You might think that this widow, why is she even giving at the temple? The temple is supposed to be giving her to look after her as a widow. In the Old Testament, there are so many verses where God instructs them to look after the widows and the orphans. So you must assume that it is her that the temple should be looking after. The church leaders in the temple should be looking after her. She shouldn't be giving anything. And yet Jesus commends her for giving. And then he denounces the church leaders who are exploiting her. Okay? So there are 2 things here. There's one message that he gives to the church leaders to say, don't exploit the poor. They're giving and sacrificing everything they have to support God's ministry, God's work. Don't exploit that. And then he commends those poor people, those widows, who don't have much when they give, because he can see what a sacrifice it is for them to give that. So I just want to say to all those who struggle to give because they have so little, and yet they give so much as a percentage of what they have, God sees that. Jesus is watching that. Just as he went and sat opposite the treasury in the temple. Every time we are making an offering at church, online, whichever way you make your offering, Jesus is watching that. He sees what you're doing. He sees what everybody is giving. And he knows when you have given more than enough. And he knows when you have not given more than enough. Because our giving, we should not give to soothe our own consciences. We should give because it gives glory to God. It shows where our heart is. That is what determines how much we should give. Not as a function of being impressed by what we have given. Most of us, if the basket comes around and we open our wallet and there's 100 notes there are 3 ways you can respond. One is to say, look, I can't give 100 rand, it's too much and I don't have change, 50 rand or 20 rand, so I'm not going to give anything. That's how some people will think. Some will say, well, I have 200 rand notes, so I'm going to give one, and they'll keep the one for themselves. Somebody will say, well, I have only 200 rand in my wallet. I'm going to give both notes. Okay? Now, the function of how you decide to do that is a function of where your heart is. It has nothing to do with how much the amount is. Because whether you give 100 rand or nothing or 200 rand, it's a function of how much you have. And God, in Jesus Christ, that's what he looks at. And this is what he was looking at as he sat there opposite the temple treasury as people were giving. He watched them giving like that. But what is this story supposed to teach us? I think apart from the message that we saw that Jesus was giving about the church leaders or religious leaders, and the message he gives to the givers, to the members, to the believers about their attitude towards giving, I think there is a third thing that is more important that he was pointing them to. I think the widow's giving points us to God's sacrificial giving. The widow is the example of how God gives. God gives everything. You're familiar with John 3, verse 16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Only one son. He gave the one son he had. So that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. That is the kind of giving God does. God gives everything he has for us. Jesus had to give his whole self from being God and become a human being. Put himself in our place completely and become one of us. And suffer ridicule. Get tired and experience all the inconveniences of being human. That's how God gives. When he gives everything. He commits everything he is to us. And this is what the widow's giving symbolizes for us. It points us to the giving of God. That God is the one who gives everything. And therefore our giving, the standard of our giving, is to aspire to that, not to anything less. Our giving is supposed to be sacrificial in the same way that God has sacrificed everything for us. In the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 3, you'll know when Paul talks about the love. He says in verse 3, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but I have not love, it profits me nothing. You see, you can give all you have to the poor so that you can gain respect and glory from people. Not because you love the poor, but because of what you gain out of it. There are rich people, billionaires, who will donate 1 billion rand to a cause. Not because they love the people, but because the publicity they get from that, the favor they get from society from that, gives them more billions. That's why they will give. And Jesus says, through Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, even if you do that, but you are not doing it out of love, it profits nothing in the eyes of God. And therefore, our giving needs to be founded and based on love. We need to be driven by love when we give, not by anything else, not by the respect we receive from those we've given to. In fact, most of the time, Jesus encourages us to give anonymously so that the people who have received don't know you are the ones who gave. Which is why we encourage that if you want to help the poor people in the church, give to the church that the church can help them. The church will not know, the members will not know, the person who is being helped will not know that it is you who helped them. And God is the one who will reward you, who will bless you for that generosity that you have given. You're showing love to members. You are not giving so that you can receive the the gratitude from the people that you're giving to. And this is what Paul says here in 1 Corinthians 13, to say, even though I can do that, unless it is driven by love, it profits me nothing. And the woman, the widow, I think, according to what Jesus gives us, that she was doing this because her heart was in seeing the temple operate. And it's interesting that even though Jesus, in the following chapter, in chapter 13, we're in chapter 12 now, in chapter 13, in fact, Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple. And yet in chapter 12, he's commending this woman giving to the structure, which he says must be destroyed. He commends her for her giving, because her giving points us to the God, to the giving that God gives, the nature of giving that we see God doing. And that is what we are called to, you and I. We must aspire to give the way God does, not the way our friends give. So when you give your offerings, don't look at what the person next to you is giving. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with who you are and what you have, how God blessed you. And that's what the base of your giving is. I know many people who can give a lot more, but because there's nobody around them who's giving 1,000 rand, they won't give 1,000 rand because they think it's too much. But they can afford to give 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 rand. And they think by giving 300 rand or 500 rand, they gave a lot more because that is the highest offering. That's not how God judges our offerings. He wants us to be cheerful givers who give from the base of our hearts. If our hearts are in His kingdom, if our hearts are in heavenly things, then we'll give the way God wants to give. Now, this is not to say we must give everything like this widow did and then there's nothing left to eat. That is not the point. The point is that our giving must be motivated by love. It must be modeled on the giving of God. The way God gives, that's how we must model our giving. And that is what the point of this story is. So in conclusion, Jesus starts the passage of today by warning church leaders who exploit members by taking church money for their own glory and lifestyles. He says, watch out for such leaders. And I want to say to you, watch out for such leaders. They said there are some members, people who used to fellowship with us. They've gone to other churches where pastors are doing this. They are foolish to be hook-winged, to be exploited in this way. And Jesus has warned us in verse 38, watch out for these religious leaders who do this for you, who dress in these special robes so that they can be given the respect, who devour the widows' houses and wealth, who like to be seated in the front seats, the VIP seats. He says, watch out for such kind of leaders, because he didn't come as such kind of leader. And pastors are supposed to be also modeling their own lives to Jesus, just as the members who give must model their own giving to Jesus' giving, to Jesus' sacrifice. All of us are pointed to look at Jesus as the model of our being. Both church leaders and members, all of us are drawn there. So the first point that he gives is to leaders. So if you are one of the church leaders in our church, if you are an elder in our church, or even a respected member of our church, Jesus says, don't look for respect and honor and VIP treatment in the church. Even in community, don't look for that. Be like everybody else. Don't demand that you must be given a special seat when you come to church. Don't have a reserved seat, a special seat. That is not how the people who serve Jesus behave. He didn't behave like that. Secondly, I mentioned that our giving must be sacrificial. It is about dedicating all we have to God's purposes. Haggai chapter 2 verse 8 says, the silver is mine and the gold is mine, declares the Lord Almighty. Everything we have, everything I have belongs to God. Now, even if I use it to feed my own children and provide for my own family, I must understand that I'm doing it on behalf of God. When I waste it, I must understand that I'm wasting that which belongs to God, not to me. And that is how, even when I give, I'm not giving, in fact, I'm returning that which God has entrusted to me. And that is how our attitude to our property should be, that our property is not ours. It belongs to Jesus. It belongs to God. And even when we offer, we're offering that which belongs to Him. He gives us to use, but ultimately it belongs to Him. And whichever way we use it, whether we're feeding our own families, whether we're looking after our neighbors, or whether we're giving at church, whatever we do with what we have, the cars we have, the houses we have, everything we have, we must understand that we're doing that on behalf of God. It belongs to God. The widow, as I said lastly, the widow points us to God's own sacrificial giving that saves us, even though we often abuse it the same way that religious leaders abuse the offerings of people. Sometimes we also abuse the sacrifice of Jesus, that He gives us this grace free without having to do anything for it. And many of us abuse the grace of God. We abuse the sacrifice of Jesus. We take it in vain. And this is what the widows are giving a dance, that she's giving to the temple and the temple is not looking after her. Jesus gives us His grace. He gives us His love. He gives us salvation, and yet we don't care about Him. This is the point that Jesus is pointing out to us. That don't be like these religious leaders who are taking from the poor without giving back. This woman, she gives to these religious leaders, but God, who we give to, He gives us back. He gives us more back. In the book of Luke, we're told that a measure pressed down, shaken together, running over will be put on your lap. That is what God does. He gives us, He blesses us so that we can be a blessing to others. And this is what this woman does. Even in her poverty, she remains a blessing. And that is what the message is of this passage. So I just want to leave you with those words for today. To say He speaks both to our desire for respect and glory in society, and Jesus denounces that. And He speaks to our desire to hold on to what we have, and points us to the widow who gives everything she has, which is a model of how God gives, who gives everything. And that is the message that I think in this passage Mark wants us to know. He is giving a warning to those who are religious leaders who are in charge of the offerings that are being given. And He's also telling members who give how they should be giving. And both people He speaks to. And I think Pastor Judas, that I started with when I started this message, he only focused on the giving of members. He didn't look at the message that Jesus had for religious leaders like him, who are sitting on special seats on the stage, who are wearing these beautiful long robes so that people can respect them and give them the special seats. He denounced that. And I'm warning you, just as Jesus warned us, when you see that, you must realize that there is danger in such people. They are not modeling themselves on Jesus, and chances are, even in how they will treat your offerings, is not how Jesus will treat them. I pray that God can continue to guide us as we challenge ourselves in our own giving, that we can become more and more like Him. And I also pray for the church leaders in our churches and everywhere, that we can also be responsible stewards of what members give, so that in all of us, members and church leaders, can continue to model our behavior by what God does, both as our leader and as the one who gives. Amen.